So they readmitted the Union. Many former Confederates were denied the right to vote or to serve in Congress. Now again, this was to be changed in a few years. Schools were set up. One of the things that black politicians did when they got into office was set up schools. Black children were being educated. Whites resisted the blacks. Jim Crow laws were enacted that enforced segregation. Well, here was the problem. Without any checks and balances in the South, there's only one party in the South, the Republican Party. That was the only party that was really allowed at this time. The Republican Party became corrupt. Now, this was true all over the nation. Now, I want to say this, so, by the way, that word party should be capitalized in this situation because it's part of the name of a proper noun. Anyway, I want to say this now, with all respect to Republicans, history has shown a period following a major war is followed by a period of low public morality. After the Civil War, there were a lot of scandals, corruption in higher places, corruption in government. After World War I, again, a whole lot of corruption. After World War II, a really lot of corruption. Again, this is just simply the way people act. The war is over, but during the war we did things that we normally don't do, and when the war is over they can't return to a sane, civilized life. At least a lot of persons don't. So corruption in government was the norm. Blacks were still unable to acquire land, so they resorted to sharecropping. Now, sharecropping. Here's what sharecropping is. It's where a bunch of people, mostly black, but sometimes poor whites, would get together and all of them farm the same plot of land. Like they might have a 100-acre plot, and all get up early in the morning, go out and work the fields till sundown, and do this 6 days a week. Well, maybe they take Saturday afternoon off. But then when it came time for harvest, they'd share, and they did not own the land, but they would pay the owner their rent, and then take the rest and split it up among them. The problem with sharecropping, at least in this case, the sharecroppers wound up producing more than they could sell, so the price of cotton fell, and many a small farmer was ruined because he was expecting to get this price from cotton. Now, I know a little bit about that because I have relatives who are farmers, and you might be expecting one price, and then all of a sudden when you take your goods to market, the price is not what you expected, and you feel like you're ruined. And in some cases, you actually are ruined. Well, okay. Let me pause for a bit here. And oh, yes. I don't want. See. Okay. About this time, people became tired of the issue of the Southerners. Now, folk, I do want to make a comparison. Some years back, an American man made close friends with a Middle Easterner, and they were talking about, what if a certain type of war broke out? The American said, listen, I believe the United States will come to your help. The Middle Easterner smiled, wanted to be polite, didn't want to offend his American friend, but he said, I know the United States will come in for a while, and then when they get ready to, they'll pull out and leave without the issue being resolved. That's happening right now at this moment, folks, as the United States is pulling out of Syria, because again, some people are getting tired of staying there. We've been there for many, many years. Now, same thing here. Some people wanted to keep Union troops in the South to enforce order, but more and more Americans had their minds on their business and just said, let the South somehow take care of itself. Without help from the North, Republican governments fell in the South. A lot of Republicans were killed, and a lot of them left. Southern Democrats took over. Blacks were heavily intimidated by Ku Klux Klansmen. You might know that the Ku Klux Klan would wear their white sheets and the hoods, disguise themselves, and go out and burn crosses, again, to terrify the blacks, and oftentimes severely injure or even kill black people who they felt were a threat to the established order. So, and this was to go on for quite some time. In the meantime, while Johnson was being impeached, the Republicans met in their convention, and they nominated General Ulysses S. Grant to be the President of the United States. Grant was popular. He was also pretty much unbeatable. In the meantime, Republicans were being murdered in the South of the hundreds. The Ku Klux Klan became more bold and started a reign of terror. Grant really wanted to do something to stop it, but he was a bad administrator himself who surrounded himself with even worse administrators. If you study Grant's biography, the only thing he ever had success at in life was as an Army officer, for one, and late in his life he had success writing his memoirs. But otherwise, everything else he attempted failed. For many years, Ulysses Grant was looked on as being the worst president the country ever had. That was before Harding. Harding, who happened to be president after World War I. Harding also endured a whole bunch of scandals he couldn't handle. Harding died after 2 years in office. Some people think he committed suicide, and others think his wife might have killed him. I mean, he was sick, he was on the road to recovery, and all of a sudden the country was told he's dead. Now, have a person, you can think they're recovering and they can die, I mean, you know, but again, it's suspicious. Anyway, the spoil system, now this is going to become a big issue in a couple chapters, chapter after next. A lot of persons were really, really hard against it, particularly when Grant appointed his buddies. Your book calls them cronies. The word cronies means persons who are you surround yourself with who are criminal. Grant surrounded himself with a whole bunch of crooks. And they said, hey, we want to have government officials to be based on merit and not on who they supported in a political party. And that's what we try to have today. We also want to make sure that once a man is hired for a government job, that he can keep that job regardless of which party is in power. To some extent we have today, not in the cabinet. The cabinet changes when the political parties change, but otherwise most of your government bureaucrats remain in office regardless of which party is in power. Anyway, but there was a move to end this spoils system. A lot of Republicans left the party, but Grant was re-elected to a second term. Maybe it was a mistake. I mean, most presidents, except for James Monroe, just about every president who was elected to a second term had a horrible time in it during his second term. Just ask Abe Lincoln, he was shot dead shortly after he took office for a second term, and you might just ask Richard Nixon. He had to resign during his second term, but most of them have had a very terrible time during the second term, and Grant's case was worse. One scandal was the salary grab. The salary grab where the Congress, members of Congress, voted themselves a pay raise, which congressmen are doing often. I mean, that's always a bad move politically, where the Congress, again, folks, let's face it, in those days, a worker was considered making a lot of money if he made $2 a day. And congressmen today could not live on that kind of salary. So they have to, from time to time, vote pay raises. But what this Congress did was, they voted at the end of the term, they voted themselves a pay raise to apply to the whole term, the last 2 years of Congress, in order to collect back pay for we're not just starting with the next term, but to collect back pay for the term they're in now. Now you had at that time a lot of lame duck congressmen. Lame duck congressmen are congressmen who have been unelected, but who still are in office because of the, I mean, when the Constitution was written, there were no airplanes, there were no trains, there were no automobiles. So that meant at the time, from the time that a person was elected to the time that he took office, there was a gap there, and that meant the old congressman was still there. These lame ducks would spend their time trying to get legislation passed that benefited them. So anyway, this was one of the scandals. Vice President was found to have accepted bribes he shouldn't have accepted, and even Grant on one occasion accepted money he shouldn't have accepted. Also, Grant made a mistake that a lot of people make when his cronies, and I'm going to call them cronies because that's what they were, when his cronies were accused, he would stand behind them and cover up for them. By the way, that's what got Richard Nixon kicked out of office. But Grant would cover up for them and stand behind them, make it difficult for them to be prosecuted, because after all, Grant was the president. Now, in the meantime, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia. Alaska was destined to become the country's 49th state. That was later. The price was about a penny and a half an acre, but everybody thought it was, they called it Seward's folly. The man who, the secretary who negotiated it, Seward, had wanted to be president himself, but he never got to be. But anyway, he purchased Alaska from Russia, but it turns out in the long run, this was a good buy. A lot of oil has been found in Alaska. Off the shores of Alaska, there's a lot of fishing. In World War II, Alaska was used as a base of operations, particularly a Navy base in our war against Japan. Well, you can't see it here very well, but basically from here, they could hit Japan. It was just about as close to from Alaska to Japan as it was from California. So Alaska was used as a base of operations by our country in World War II. Don't tell me, okay. Don't tell me this thing is acting up. Oh my. It won't do what I'm trying to tell it to do now. Okay. Grant wanted to see blacks protected, and again, one of the things he did, he got his Civil Rights Act passed. Wait a minute, we're backing up a little bit. France had taken over Mexico. I mentioned that, and that was one reason Lincoln felt pressured to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. A puppet government controlled by Napoleon III of France had taken over Mexico. The United States sent an ambassador to Napoleon and told Napoleon, get out of Mexico. The United States was ready to go to war against France on account of the issue. I mean, some people thought this would help unite the country. Hey, we're being invaded, our neighbors being invaded. Also, the president of Mexico at the time, Benito Juarez, was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln, owing to the fact that Lincoln had opposed the Mexican War. And Juarez was forced into exile when Maximilian came in. I mean, anyway, that's a separate story, but to make a long story short, the Americans opposed the government. The French army left Mexico when the Civil War was over. Maximilian was shot by Benito Juarez, who took back over. Maximilian and his wife both were shot dead. Grant, Lincoln, and Johnson, all three presidents in a row, wanted Santo Domingo. Congress thwarted Grant's efforts against Santo Domingo. The country went into a depression in 1873. Poke. If you study economics, generally, the economy goes upward, but there are often have been dips. Now what we have today, the Federal Reserve moves in. When the economy is moving fast, the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates, Congress will raise taxes, and that will cut off. And in the meantime, they try to fill in the troughs with In other words, try to smooth things out, cut off the highs, fill up the lows, cut off the highs, fill up the lows. This policy has worked for a good many years. There are still downturns. There are persons who believe that our economic policy is delaying the inevitable, and there could come a biggest depression that we have seen in many a lifetime. But that's something to be seen. It might not happen. My dad always believed the depression was coming. He died in 1985 without seeing it. But he was a child. He lived through the Great Depression of the 30s. The next depression after this one, which we'll talk about, was the worst depression we had ever had. Not this one, but the one that occurred in the 1890s was the worst one we ever had. But then it came the Depression of the 30s that lasted and lasted and lasted. And we'll spend a whole chapter talking about that. Anyway, the nation was weary of the Civil War issues and race issues. They just simply said, let the South take care of itself. We don't care anymore. We're sick of it. So they pulled out. Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed against the Klan. It was not strongly enforced. Segregation remained the rule in the South. Congress finally decided that the best way for the South to handle itself was to allow almost all of your ex-Confederates to have their citizenship restored. So except for 300 Confederate leaders, all the others were given rights to hold office. They figured that these ex-Confederates had a better chance of bringing order to the South than anyone else, and they were probably right. Now, I can name a couple of them. Jefferson Davis never had his citizenship restored. The old history books will tell you that Robert E. Lee never gained his citizenship. But Robert E. Lee applied for his citizenship in 1868. In 1978, 110 years after he applied for it, his descendants were told that Congress had restored his citizenship. Lee had been dead for 108 years. But 108 years after he died, Lee's citizenship was restored. As for Davis, I don't think he ever did regain his. Anyway, now here is something that's the South found a way around the 14th and 15th Amendment. One of the things they set up was a poll tax. The poll tax simply meant that when you went to the polls to vote, you had to pay a tax. The Southern people said this is necessary to raise money that our government needs. No, it meant that blacks could not vote because most blacks were too poor to pay a tax. Now the poll tax was outlawed by the 24th Amendment that was passed while John Kennedy was president. No, Kennedy had nothing to do with it because the president does not get involved in amendments. So I know Lincoln pushed for the 13th Amendment. But generally presidents have to sit back and see if the Congress will approve of them or if the states will. Anyway, the poll tax was outlawed in the early 1960s. Then there was another way that they kept blacks from voting, the literacy test. They'd give a test. All right, now folk, do any of you know in this morning's class about what did it take to pass a literacy test in the South? Any of you know? Yeah, you could pass the literacy test, yeah, but what did you have to pass the literacy test? You had to have a white skin. Essentially, now, don't get me wrong now, there was a black man with a PhD who failed the test, and a white man who was illiterate who passed it. And sometimes the blacks were given the test in Chinese. In other words, I mean, I'm not saying the blacks were too ignorant, it was just that they were simply, the test was put to them in such a way that they had no chance of passing it. But they gave one black man a test, and he looked at it, it was written in Chinese. And they said, "Can you read this?" He said, "Sure, I can read it." Oh, they were supposed to, he said, "What does it say?" He says, "It says there won't be very many black men voting on election day." We can laugh about it now, but it was this, I mean, folk, I don't want to sweep it under the rug. This actually happened. Now, and the Supreme Court ruled all this stuff legal. And folk, this is frightening when the Supreme Court, by the way, Justice Taney was still Chief Justice When the southern states left the Union, Justice Taney remained on the court, even though he was a Southerner, and he remained on the court. And again, he still continued. Now, he could not restore slavery. I mean, not even Taney would do that. But he made sure that blacks did not vote and made sure that blacks really were not truly citizens. Again, the power that the Supreme Court can wield is, well, quite frankly, unconstitutional. After a time, the North largely left the South alone. Republicans were, the word ostracized here means sent off into exile, kicked out of the South. Whites were discouraged from associating with blacks. Whites who did were called all kinds of uncomplimentary names, and I'm not going to use those words right here, right now. I mean, anyone, it could be, the word I could use would be taken out of context, could be taken out of context, so I'm not going to use it. But derogatory terms were used against blacks. All this while the North sat by and said, we just don't care anymore. The 1876 election was the most tumultuous election in the history of the United States. Eventually, General Hayes, who was a Union general also, was declared the winner. Here's the story. Some of the southern states sent two sets of returns. One set of the returns said Hayes was the winner in that state. Another set said Tilden. Tilden was the president running against Hayes. There were 20 votes, the electoral votes, that were in hard dispute. Did the electoral votes rightfully belong to Hayes or Tilden? To this day, nobody really knows. Now, they later passed a law that the returns that bore the governor's signature were to be considered official. Nevertheless, with no one having a clear winning, the election was thrown to the House of Representatives. And the election occurred in November, during the month of November, December, January, February. 4 months, we did not know who our next president would be. But about 2 or 3 days before the inauguration, the House voted to let Hayes become the president. After Hayes made a promise that said, if you'll make me president, the first thing I'll do is I will remove the last of the federal troops from the South. So they made Hayes president, and after his inauguration, General Hayes, now Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army, issued an executive order, presidential order, that all federal troops were to be removed from the South. This is officially the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was over. It is a revolution but half accomplished. Republicans, though, had almost lost the election, and they learned they could no longer wave the bloody shirt and say, we're the party that saved the Union, and then rule with all kinds of corruption. The corruption almost ruined the Republican Party here. Eventually, it was to hurt them later. In the meantime, the Democrats had taken over the House of Representatives, actually 2 years before the 1876. In 1874, the Democrats took over the House of Representatives. But nevertheless, they declared Hayes the winner of the election with just 3 days left to go before inauguration. Hayes governed for 4 years and then left office. All right. Make it easier on me.